You've seen me without a stitch of clothing on. Now you have to marry me, or they'll punish us both. That was the whisper of the Apache Girl. Before we delve into this dramatic story, don't forget to like the video and let us know where you're watching from.
8 Spring, 1879, in Las Cruces, New Mexico Territory. The dirt roads, damp from last night's rain, were dark and heavy, with deep ruts filled with shallow water reflecting the weak light of dawn. The smell of damp earth, mesquite smoke, and sour beer from the saloon across the street permeated the town. You've seen me without a stitch of clothing on. Now you have to marry me, or they'll punish us both. That was the whisper of the Apache Girl. Before we delve into this dramatic story, don't forget to like the video and let us know where you're watching from. Late spring, 1879, in Las Cruces, New Mexico Territory. The dirt roads, damp from last night's rain, were dark and heavy, with deep ruts filled with shallow water reflecting the weak light of dawn. The smell of damp earth, mesquite smoke, and sour beer from the saloon across the street permeated the town. Eli, a 32-year-old man with a sturdy build and lean physique from years of outdoor work, stepped onto the street and walked up to the porch of the Railroad Workers Inn. His face held the calm demeanor of a man who had been through things most men wouldn't dare mention. Having served as a scout for the U.S. Cavalry in the Apache Wars, Eli had crossed dangerous lands where a small mistake could have cost him his life. That experience had taught him to recognize trouble before it happened. Now, he worked for a freight company, protecting shipments between towns. Today, he was in Las Cruces to collect payment for a shipment he had overseen, bolts of cloth, barrels of flour, and a crate of tools transported from Mesilla. The job was simple: get the money, get supplies, and head north before the afternoon. Inside the lobby, a single oil lamp illuminated the room, the air stale and heavy. A large man with a flushed face leaned back in a chair by the wall, boots crossed and chewing on a toothpick. Another lay unconscious on a bench, an empty liquor bottle rolling under his hand. Eli nodded to them and entered the narrow hallway leading to the back rooms, where he was told the owner would be in his office. Halfway down, he stopped. There was a sound too faint to be furniture shifting, a short, sharp, stifled sob of a woman. His heart beat faster, not out of fear, but a heightened focus from knowing he was stepping into something that wasn't his business, but might require his intervention. He followed the sound until he reached a door with a bent latch and peeling paint, without a lock. The door frame was cracked as if it had been pried open many times. He placed his palm on the wood and pushed. The door slowly groaned open. The room was hardly bigger than a closet. There was only an old bed, a tin basin on the floor, and a small, nailed-shut window above the bed, with no other openings. The air was thick with the smell of damp cloth and unwashed bodies. In the corner of the room, a young Apache woman was squatting, her body hunched over. She looked to be in her early 20s, with copper skin and long, wet black hair, as if she had been sweating or in the rain. She wore only a thin, ivory-colored linen shift, torn at the neckline and slit high on one side. The fabric clung to her body in the humid air. Her eyes were black, unblinking, locked on Eli. There was fear in them, but it was buried beneath something sharper, perhaps defiance, even anger. Eli stopped at the threshold, his hand still on the door frame. He had seen Apache women in many different circumstances during the war, most of them terrible. But this girl was different. Her gaze held no pleading, only a clear warning. "Don't mistake me for helpless, cowboy," she said, her voice low and sharp, her English with a distinct cadence, each word delivered with intention. "Now you have to marry me, or they'll kill us both." Eli's brow furrowed. The words didn't make complete sense at first, but the tone did. He glanced over his shoulder into the empty hallway. "Who's coming?" "They kept me here," she said. "They said I was no longer worth trading. Now they're going to sell me to men who kill quickly." Her voice didn't waver, but her hands tightened on the hem of her shift. Before he could ask more, the hallway came alive, heavy boots on the floorboards, the jingle of spurs, and a man's voice, hoarse with whiskey, shouted, "Time's up." Another voice laughed, high-pitched and brief. Eli stepped fully inside and kicked the door shut with his heel. The noise in the hall grew closer. "What's this?" one man yelled. "You think she's yours now?" Eli slid the rickety chair under the doorknob. He didn't answer. His mind quickly weighed his options. He could turn and walk away, leave her there, tell himself it wasn't his business. But the memory of other women, in other towns, in worse rooms, came flooding back. He looked at her and pointed to the small, nailed-shut window. "We can get out that way." She watched him for a moment, weighing him. Men had given her orders before, and those orders had come at a cost. But this wasn't the same. His voice was calm, his eyes steady. She gave a slight nod. Eli crossed the room, pulled his folding knife from his belt, and slid it under the window frame. The old paint cracked with a dry snap. He pushed until the frame was loose enough to open. Eli slid his folding knife from his belt into the window frame, and the old paint on the frame cracked dryly. He pushed with all his might until the frame was loose enough to open. Quickly, he took off his travel jacket and offered it to her. The Apache Girl, Tahana, hesitated at first, but then she took the jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The oversized coat swallowed her small frame, but it covered her bare skin. Just then, a fist pounded on the door. The chair propped against the doorknob rattled. "Hurry," Eli said, his voice firm but low. He lifted her by the waist, careful not to touch her inappropriately, and placed her feet on the damp ground outside. Then he followed, jumping out into the narrow alley behind the inn. The smell of damp dust filled his lungs. Eli took her hand, not a tight grip, just enough to keep her close, and moved quickly down the alley, past barrels and the back doors of the saloon. Behind them, shouts echoed, and the sound of boots hurried in pursuit. At the far edge of the freight yard, his wagon was waiting. It had a canvas top, a water barrel, and a bedroll on the corner. He lifted the girl inside without a word, then lowered the canvas top and climbed onto the driver's seat. Rain pattered. The team of horses began to move, their hooves splashing water through the mud puddles. The shouting behind them faded. Eli didn't look back. He could feel her eyes watching him through the canvas. He knew, as the wagon rolled out of Las Cruces, that his simple job had just turned into something entirely different, and there was no turning back. The wagon rattled as it crossed a deep rut, leaving the wet streets of Las Cruces for the rolling hills dotted with mesquite bushes. Eli kept the team at a steady pace, not so fast as to attract attention, but fast enough that if the men from the inn did give chase, they would have a hard time catching up. The rain had cooled the air, but the heat was beginning to return. His hands stayed tight on the reins, his eyes scanning the road ahead and the bushes on either side. Inside the covered wagon, Tahana sat with her legs crossed on the bedroll, Eli's jacket wrapped around her like a blanket. The canvas top blocked her view, but she could feel the sway of the wagon and the rhythm of the horse's hooves, each bump making her tighten her grip on the jacket. She tried to keep her breathing steady, even though her chest still felt heavy from the last half hour of terror. In her mind, the faces of the men in the hallway kept reappearing, sneering, drunken, sure that they could decide her fate without her having a say. Eli's defense of her did not mean she could trust him completely right away. However, he hadn't touched her, except to help her out of the window, and that meant something. She clutched the jacket tighter around herself and looked straight ahead. "Where are you taking me?" she asked. Eli didn't turn around. "North," he said. "I have a shipment to guard up to Mesilla Springs. After that, we'll see where it's safe." "What will you do when we get there?" Her voice was even, but there was something beneath it, perhaps a test of him. He kept his eyes fixed forward. "That depends on whether those men decide to follow." "Is there anyone who will come looking for you?" "No," she said after a long pause. "No one left." Eli had suspected as much. He had seen too many raids that left nothing but scattered survivors, each wearing a similar expression, a mixture of stubborn will and silent sadness. The road dipped down into a shallow creek bed. He slowed the team, steering them down the bank, the wheels creaking as they rolled through a patch of wet sand. He had learned to use places like this, places where tracks were harder to read. If someone was following, it would take them time to figure out which way the wagon had gone. Once they were back on solid ground, he let the team walk while he reached for the water jug from under the seat. He glanced back, holding the jug through the opening in the canvas. "Drink. It's a long way before we stop." Tahana hesitated, then reached for it. The water was cool, tasting of metal from the tin jug, but it soothed her throat. She took 2 slow sips before handing it back. "Why did you help me?" "I didn't see much of a choice," Eli said. "They would have harmed you. I've been there. That makes it my business." He paused, then added, "I don't walk away from that." Her eyes stayed on him for another moment before she settled back, pulling the jacket tighter. She didn't reply, but something in her shoulders relaxed. By midday, the hills began to open into a flat, pale grassland. Eli found a low stand of trees near a dry creek bed and steered the wagon off the main road. The shade was thin but enough to block the harsh heat. He tied the horses and climbed into the back. "Food?" he asked. She nodded once, though she didn't move until he laid out a small tin plate with bread, jerky, and a strip of hard cheese. He pushed it toward her, then took his own portion. She realized then that he had given her the larger share. They ate in silence at first, the only sound the rustle of wind through the sparse leaves. When Tahana finally spoke, her voice was smaller. "They will kill you, too." Eli looked at her. "I take it that's what you meant back in the room. They believe that if an Apache woman is seen unclothed by a white man, she is ruined, no longer valuable for trade, no longer worth keeping." Her eyes turned sharp as she said it. "And that man, they would kill him for touching what they say is theirs." Eli's jaw tightened. Doesn't sound like any of it was worth keeping. They finished the meal without another word. When the plates were cleared, he checked the harnesses and made sure the wagon was ready to move. Tahana, without being asked, neatly folded the bedroll and placed it against the side of the wagon. She caught him watching and held his gaze for a moment before turning away. Late in the afternoon, they reached a small watering stop, nothing more than a hand pump next to a shack. Eli filled the water jug, his eyes scanning the empty land. No riders in sight. That didn't mean they weren't coming. As the wagon rolled north again, the sun sank lower, casting long shadows on the road. Eli knew they needed to find a place to make camp before dark, a place with enough cover that the light from a small fire wouldn't be seen. He also knew that the next part of the journey would force them to be closer. The same wagon, the same fire, no walls between them. That could either build trust or break it. He didn't know which way this woman would go, but he knew one thing: the decision to help her in Las Cruces had been made, and there was no one making it. The last light of the day faded on the flat fields as Eli drove the wagon off the trail toward a low mound of land with scattered pinyon pines and scrub oak. It wasn't much, but the ground here was higher than the surrounding plain, offering a clear view in all directions. If anyone was following, they would see the light of a fire, so he kept it small, just enough to boil coffee and keep off the night chill. He unharnessed the horses, tying the reins to a low branch. The team settled quickly, their heads down in the thick grass. Eli moved slowly and deliberately, checking each strap before unrolling the bedrolls. The quiet work gave him time to think. He still didn't know the full story of how Tahana had ended up in that back room. He knew the shape of it: raids, trades, a line of men who thought they owned her, but not the details. Part of him wanted to ask, to understand what kind of trouble might be chasing them. Another part knew that pressing her too soon might make her shut down completely. Tahana stayed near the wagon at first, the travel jacket wrapped tight around her, her eyes watching him as he worked. Finally, she moved closer, squatting near the fire and beginning to arrange the bread and salt pork that he had laid out. Her hands were quick and efficient. She had done this before, camping, moving from place to place with little she could carry. Eli poured 2 cups of coffee, handing one to her before taking his own. "We'll leave early," he said. "Put some distance on them before the sun's up." She nodded, sipping carefully. The warmth from the tin cup was a bridge between them. A moment later, she asked, "The men who took me, they will follow?" "Maybe," Eli said. "Depends on if they have the guts to cross the sheriff's path." She looked at him over the rim of the cup. And if they do? Then we'll deal with that when it happens. His voice was steady, not dismissive, and she seemed to take some reassurance from that. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the wood and the rustle of wind in the branches. Eli noticed she never turned her back to the open plain. Even when she moved to wash her hands at the water barrel, she kept her face pointed toward the trail, her eyes scanning like a scout. When the food was gone, Eli reached for his jacket, but she stopped him with a slight shake of her head. "I'll mend it first," she said. He hesitated, then handed it to her. She pulled a small bone needle from a pouch tied at her hip under the jacket, threading it with practiced dexterity. In the firelight, she worked on the ripped seam near the shoulder, where the fabric had been pulled apart weeks ago. Her hands were sure, the stitches neat. He realized she was making the jacket sturdier than it had been before. "You sound like a person who has had to mend a lot of things with very little," he said softly. She didn't look up. "If I waited for someone else to mend what was mine, I'd have nothing left." That hung between them for a long moment. When she was done, she folded the jacket and placed it next to him. Her eyes flickered to the wagon canvas and then back to him. "In the room, you did not look at me the way they looked." "Why?" Eli met her gaze. "Because I've seen enough of what happens when men stop seeing a woman as a person. I didn't want to be one of them." She held his gaze for another beat, then turned away, but not in dismissal, more like she was filing his words away next to his previous actions. The night chilled quickly. Eli laid out a bedroll on each side of the small fire, giving her space. She lay down, still wrapped in his jacket, her hair spread over her shoulders, her eyes heavy-lidded but alert. Eli sat back against a rock, his rifle across his knees, watching the horizon until the last streak of red faded to black. Hours later, as the wind picked up and the fire died down, he glanced over and saw that she was finally asleep. For the first time since Las Cruces, her face wasn't strained with fear. He shifted his rifle, tossed another branch on the fire, and kept watch. Tomorrow they would push deeper into the open country, fewer places to hide but fewer people to run into. If they could stay ahead of the trouble for another day or two, maybe they would find a patch of land where no one knew her name or his. He didn't know if she would want to stay with him after that point, but tonight, by the small fire, it seemed like she might. Eli woke before dawn, the kind of waking that came from years of little sleep and knowing when the night was over. The air was cold enough for his breath to come out in faint wisps. The fire had died down to embers, and the eastern sky held the first thin gray light. He got up quietly from his bedroll, careful not to wake Tahana. She was still wrapped in his jacket, lying on her side, one hand near her face, the other tucked under her. Her hair had slipped across her cheek in the night. She looked younger this way, without the hardness she carried when she was awake. He knew better than to mistake the rest for peace. Sleep didn't erase what she had been through, but this was the first time since that back room in Las Cruces that she hadn't seemed tense. Eli moved to the small water barrel, splashed water on his face, and began to pack up. They would leave early, putting more distance between themselves and anyone still in pursuit. As he worked, he thought of her question from last night, why he hadn't looked at her the way those men had. It wasn't the first time someone had asked him something similar, but it was the first time he felt the weight of the answer matter. By the time the sun crested, the wagon was ready. He heated water for coffee, the smell of it filling the camp. That more than anything woke her up. She sat up slowly, pushing her hair back and pulling the jacket tighter around her. "You didn't wake me," she said, her voice husky from sleep. "Didn't need to," Eli replied. "I had it." She glanced at the supplies strapped to the wagon bed. "You've been doing this alone a long time." "Long enough," he said. He didn't add that it was easier alone, less to lose, fewer people to protect. But as she moved to the fire and took the tin cup he offered, he wondered if he was wrong about that. While they drank, he asked the question he had held since Las Cruces, "How did you end up in that room?" "Taken from my people 2 years ago," she said, her eyes still on her cup. "Traded between camps, sometimes sold, sometimes just given away. The last ones brought me here. They said I was valuable if kept clean." then a man tried to take what wasn't his. I fought back, tore the shift. They said I was ruined. She looked up at him, and there was no self-pity in her voice, just the stark truth of it. That's when they locked me in the room, deciding what to do with me. Eli nodded slowly. It confirmed what he had guessed, but hearing it made it clearer. No one is looking for you. No one left, she said. He didn't press for more. Some stories didn't need every detail told to understand the truth. They broke camp quickly. The road wound through a shallow canyon for the morning, the sandstone walls hiding them from sight. Eli kept a steady pace, glancing back occasionally. No dust on the horizon, no riders. Around midday, they stopped at a creek, narrow enough to step across but deep enough to have water. Tahana knelt on the bank, washing her hands and face, then washing the shirt she wore under the jacket. She wrung it out and laid it on a rock to dry. Her movements were precise and practiced. Eli noticed she didn't seem shy about doing it in front of him now, not careless, but no longer hiding like before. It was trust, maybe, just a little. He offered her his blue work shirt. Wear this until it dries. She pulled it on, the sleeves long past her hands, the hem reaching her knees. Do you have another shirt? She asked. 2, he said. I'll manage. They ate by the creek, hard bread and dried meat, before moving on. The road ahead led up a ridge with a wide view of the valley. From there, Eli could see a faint line of a farm road cutting toward a clump of cottonwood trees in the distance. We'll make camp there, he said. Water, maybe some shelter. When they arrived, the sun was low. The cottonwoods stood around a slow bend of the creek, their shadows deep and cool. A weathered shack sat nearby, old but still standing. Eli checked the creaking door hinges and found it dusty but solid inside. A narrow bed, a wood stove, and enough room for both of them. He put his things inside, then went back to the wagon. Tahana was standing at the edge of the creek, watching the last light on the water. When she turned toward him, he saw something in her face had softened. This place is quiet, she said. For now, Eli replied. And quiet is worth keeping. That night, the fire in the stove kept off the chill. They sat at the small table, eating in a silence that was no longer heavy. When she met his gaze across the flickering lamp, there was no defiance in it, just a steady look that felt like the beginning of something neither of them had yet spoken aloud. It wasn't safety yet, but it was closer than yesterday, and for both of them, that was enough to keep moving forward. The next morning at the shack was clear and cool, the pale blue sky promising heat later in the day. Eli was outside before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, tightening the horses' harnesses and checking the grease on the wagon axles. Tahana came out the door a few minutes later, his jacket still on her shoulders, her hair braided neatly back from her face. She looked more relaxed than he had ever seen her. Inside, the stove fire had died but the air still held the faint scent of last night's bread and coffee. Eli put a fresh pot of coffee on the embers while she went out to wash her face at the creek. He watched her for a moment, not staring, just noting how her eyes kept moving, scanning the treeline and the slope above the water. It wasn't the behavior of a timid person, it was a habit born of years of never feeling safe. They ate quickly, bread, jerky, coffee, and decided to stay long enough to mend some gear. Eli's saddle blanket needed a patch, and Tahana's shirt, not yet dry, had several tears that would worsen if left alone. She volunteered to do the mending, sewing while Eli sharpened his knife on a wet stone. Mid-morning, the quiet was broken. It started with a faint vibration in the air, the sound of distant hooves. Eli's head snapped up immediately, his eyes narrowed on the eastern slope. Tahana noticed the change in his posture and put her needle down without a word. Get inside, Eli said, already moving toward the wagon. He took his rifle from its rack and leaned it against the wall, then unholstered his pistol from his belt and checked the cylinder. He didn't intend to use it unless he had to, but he wasn't going to be caught by surprise. The riders appeared a minute later, 3 men, each moving at a steady pace, not hurried but not leisurely either. Their clothes were trail-worn, but the way their eyes scanned the ground told Eli they weren't casual travelers. He recognized one of the faces from Las Cruces, the man who had laughed outside the back room door. They stopped about 50 yards from the shack, the leader holding his horse still while the other two fanned out a little, trying to size up the situation. Eli stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, his posture relaxed but ready. "Morning," the leader called out, his voice slick as if he was trying to be polite after already making up his mind. Eli didn't reply. The man grinned. "We're looking for an Apache girl, small, might have been wearing a thin shift last we saw her. Seen anyone like that?" Eli kept his voice level. "There's no one here for you to worry about." The man's eyes flickered toward the shack. "Because word is she left town in a hurry. Be a shame if she ran into trouble out here." Eli didn't move. "You're the trouble. You people ride on. That's the only warning you'll get." A long silence stretched between them. The man's grin hardened, but he didn't advance. Instead, he spat on the ground, jerked his chin at the others, and turned his horse. "We'll be seeing you again soon, freight man." Eli watched until they disappeared over the mound of land. He didn't relax. They'll be back, and next time there won't just be 3 of them. Inside, Tahana stood by the window, her eyes fixed on where the riders had disappeared. "They won't stop," she said softly. "No," Eli agreed. "But neither will I." She looked at him as if gauging the weight of that promise. "You could leave me," she said. "Just go, let them take me." Eli shook his head. "Not happening." For a long moment, she didn't reply, then she went back to the table, picked up her needle and thread, and began sewing again, the small, precise movements of her hands each stitch sharper than the last. By evening, Eli had made his decision. "We'll move at dawn," he said. "Find a place where they'll have to think hard before following us." Tahana didn't ask where, she just nodded. For the first time, she seemed to accept that wherever they went next, they would go together. Outside, the wind had shifted, bringing with it a faint scent of dust from the east. Eli knew that meant riders were moving somewhere out of sight. It only strengthened his resolve. If they wanted her, they would have to get through him, and that wasn't going to happen while he was still breathing. The first light of day hadn't yet touched the tops of the cottonwoods when Eli unharnessed the team. The air was cold enough for his fingers to ache on the leather straps. He moved quickly but without noise, every movement deliberate. If the men from yesterday had camped nearby, he didn't want to give them time to close the distance. Tahana came out of the shack as he was checking the wagon's rigging. Her hair was braided tightly, the end of the braid resting on the blue shirt of his, which she still wore under the travel jacket. Her own shirt, now mended, was folded neatly and tucked into the bundle of her belongings. She looked at him once, then scanned the trees the way he did, her head turning slowly, her eyes sweeping through the shadows. "You slept?" Eli asked. "A little," she said. "Enough." They climbed onto the wagon seat and Eli gave the reins a gentle snap. The team pulled them back onto the narrow road heading north. The creek ran parallel for about a mile before veering west, and then the land opened up into rolling grasslands cut by dry creek beds. Eli kept the team at a steady pace. He said nothing for the first hour, his eyes fixed on the path ahead, but his thoughts kept circling the same point. There was no telling how far these men were willing to chase, and no guarantee the law in the next town would be willing to interfere. If they were going to get through this, they needed to put real distance between them and Las Cruces. By mid-morning, the sun was climbing fast. Eli slowed the team to rest them, pulling the wagon off the trail toward a clump of mesquite for shade. They climbed down and Tahana stepped lightly off the seat, stretching her legs. He noticed she moved differently now, still cautious but with less tension in her shoulders. While he watered the horses, she took the water jug and washed her hands, then moved to the back of the wagon and began checking the ropes on the supplies. Eli watched for a moment before joining her. "You've traveled like this before," he said. "Not in a wagon," she replied. "But I know how to make things stay where they belong." Her answer was simple, but it filled in a gap in what he knew about her. She had been moved from place to place, but she wasn't a stranger to travel, the endurance it took, the way to make and break a camp quickly. It made her more than a passenger. They ate a quick meal of bread and jerky under the mesquite. Tahana tore her portion in half and handed the rest to him. "You will need it," she said. "I gave you the larger share yesterday," he reminded her. She looked him squarely in the eye and said, "And I took notice." By the time they moved on, the wind had shifted. Eli smelled dust before he saw it, a faint haze on the horizon behind them. He didn't point it out, but he picked up the pace of the team, pushing them until the road curved into a shallow canyon. The rock walls here offered cool shade, and the narrow turns would keep them out of long-range sight. Near midday, they stopped again, this time in the lee of a sandstone bluff where a small stream trickled into a rock basin. Eli filled the water jug while Tahana knelt to wash her face and hands. The travel jacket slipped from her shoulder and she pulled it back up without looking at him. "Yesterday," she said. "When they came to the shack, you didn't even think before you stepped out to face them." "I thought enough to have a rifle in my hand," Eli said. "Not that," she said. She turned to him, water still glistening on her jaw. "You could have told them I wasn't there, sent them looking somewhere else. And if they'd come inside and found you, I'd have to kill them or watch them take you," he said. "That wasn't an option." She looked at him for a long moment, then down at the water. "No one has ever stood like that for me before." He didn't have an answer that didn't sound like he was talking too big, so he let it hang there, and she didn't press. They made camp early that evening on a flat mound of land overlooking the trail. From here, they could see for miles in every direction. Eli built a small fire, shielded from view by the wagon, and put a pot of beans on to heat. Tahana stayed close, arranging supplies and folding her mended shirt into her bundle. When the food was ready, they sat side by side on the lower tailgate of the wagon. The sky above them was darkening toward sunset, the air chilling quickly. She finished her portion and rested her hands in her lap. "When this is over," she said softly, "what will you do?" "Depends on what over looks like," Eli said. "And if it's safe?" He glanced at her. "Then I'll go where I'm wanted." Her gaze held his longer than usual, and he realized she was offering him the same answer in her own way, without saying it directly. Later, when they turned in for the night, the air was cold enough that the bedrolls were pulled close to the fire. They slept near each other for warmth, not touching but not distant. Eli was awake for a while, listening for the sound of distant hooves. There were none. For now, they had the lead. How long they could keep it was still a question, but he was starting to think the answer mattered to him for reasons that had nothing to do with the chase. The next morning, a strong wind blew from the west, carrying a fine dust that settled in the seams of the wagon's canvas and stung their eyes. Eli was up early, tightening every strap and covering before they set out. He wanted to put more miles between them and the old camp. He hadn't seen riders yesterday, but the faint dust plume on the horizon was still in his mind. Tahana came out of her bedroll, her braid loose from the night's sleep, the collar of his blue shirt turned up against the wind. She handed him the water jug without being asked, a small gesture but one that told him she was settling into the rhythm of the journey. They set out before the sun had cleared the low hills. The road here was rough, littered with rocks and patches of loose sand. Eli kept the team moving but gave them breaks when the wheels bogged in the soft earth, and he climbed down to walk alongside until the ground firmed up. Tahana followed his lead without complaint, stepping down to push on the wagon frame when extra weight was needed. By midday, they found a shallow arroyo with a few cottonwood trees bent in the wind. Eli watered the horses and checked the back axle. Tahana knelt beside him, pointing to a cracked leather strap on one of the harnesses. "This will break soon," she said. He ran his hand over the tear and nodded. Sharp eyes. From the tool chest, he took a short length of rawhide and began to replace the strap. She held the harness steady for him without being told, her fingers sure but careful. When the work was done, they shared a cold meal, bread softened in water and strips of dried meat. Not much but fast, and they need daylight. As they ate, Tahana glanced south, her face tense. "I hear something," she said. Eli listened. At first, it was just the wind, then a faint, uneven but steady beat, the sound of hooves, distant but getting closer. He stood up, scanning the ridgeline. 3 riders appeared against the pale sky, moving at a steady pace. "They're back," he said softly. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice calm but low. "Get us out of sight." He wasted no more words. Eli led the team down into the arroyo, steering toward a crack in the bank where the wagon could pass through. The ground here was soft with last season's leaves, muffling their sound. He found a narrow turn between 2 ridges, deep enough to hide the wagon from view. They waited. The horses were restless, their ears pricked to the wind. Tahana crouched by the wagon wheel, her eyes fixed on the gap in the ridge. A few minutes later, the riders passed above them, faint figures against the sky. One slowed, his eyes scanning the valley floor, but no one looked down into the gap. The sound of hooves faded. When they were gone, Eli let out a slow breath. "We'll take a detour from here." The detour was slower. They moved through rougher terrain, crossing dry creek beds and pushing through mesquite thickets. The sun was low by the time Eli spotted a rock outcrop with a deep overhang, enough shelter for both of them in the wagon. They made camp under the rock. The fire was small, just a flicker in the recess of the rock. While the beans heated, Tahana went to get water from a nearby spring. When she returned, she stood watching him for a moment before speaking. "You could have fought them today," she said. "You hit us instead." "You fight when you have to," Eli replied. "You hide when it keeps you alive." Her eyes stayed on him, weighing the words. "And you will hide again for me?" He met her gaze. "As long as I have to." The silence that followed was not empty. She sat beside him, close enough for their shoulders to touch, and neither of them moved away. They ate that way, with few words. The wind outside the overhang had died down as it got dark, leaving only the soft sound of the burning wood and their steady breathing. Before turning in, Tahana took her mended shirt from her bundle and laid it out beside her bedroll. "I will wear this again in the morning," she said. "Not because I owe them the shame, but because it is mine." Eli gave a single nod. "Then it is yours still." That night they slept closer than before, the cold pushing them toward the same blanket. No words were exchanged, no promises made, but when Eli woke in the middle of the night, her hand was resting lightly on his arm. He didn't move it away. They still had distance to travel and men behind them, but for the first time since Las Cruces, the thought of reaching the end of the road didn't feel impossible anymore. It felt like something they could choose together. They broke camp before the first light touched the edge of the overhang. The air was damp from a night breeze that had carried the smell of wet earth. Eli had the wagon moving north within minutes, following the detour as he had promised. The ground was rough, but it kept them hidden from the wide view. Tahana sat beside him on the wagon seat, wearing her mended shirt under his jacket. The braid from last night was still neat down her back. She said little, her eyes scanning the ridges ahead as he did. It wasn't just his fight anymore, she was a part of it, reading the terrain for threats just as he was. Mid-morning, the trail narrowed into a box canyon with sheer walls on either side. Eli didn't like it, too many blind spots. He urged the horses forward but kept one hand near the rifle resting across his knees. Halfway through, the sound came, fast hooves, echoing between the walls. "Down," he said sharply. Tahana slid off the seat into the wagon bed, crouching low under the canvas. Eli stopped the team, his eyes fixed on the curve ahead. Moments later, 3 riders burst into view, the same men from before, their horses kicking up dust and sparks from the rock. The leader stopped about 20 yards away, a pistol held loosely in his hand. "Told you we'd be seeing you again, freight man," he said. His eyes flickered to the wagon bed. "The girl comes with us." Eli didn't move from his seat. "She's my wife," he said levelly. The man sneered. "A piece of paper won't stop me." "Maybe not," Eli replied. "But this will." His hand shifted just enough for the rifle barrel to clear his knees. The other 2 riders fanned out a little, trying to flank him in the narrow space. Tahana's voice came from under the canvas, small but steady. "If you shoot, they'll kill you before you can reload." "I know," Eli said without turning around. He aimed the rifle at the leader's chest, his finger on the trigger. For a moment, no one moved. The wind whistling through the canyon was the only sound. Then the leader's sneer faded. "She's not worth dying for today." He jerked his chin and all three turned their horses, riding back the way they had come. Eli waited until the sound disappeared before lowering his rifle. "Stay down until I say." When she climbed back onto the seat, Tahana's eyes were sharp. "You didn't have to tell him I was your wife." "I did," Eli said. It was the only thing that made him hesitate. She looked at him for a moment, then gave a slow nod. "If you're going to claim that to keep me safe, you should mean it." The rest of the day passed in tense silence. They stayed off the main road, stopping only once for water. Eli knew those men weren't gone for good. They would regroup and try again. But each time they failed, they were more likely to get reckless. He could turn that into his advantage. Late in the afternoon, they found a sheltered hollow near a line of willows. The creek there ran clear and cold, and the ground was soft with grass. It was the safest place they had been in days. Eli unharnessed the horses while Tahana built a small fire. As the beans heated, she sat across from him, the firelight catching her face and turning it gold. "You have risked your life for me twice now," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I'll keep doing it until I don't have to anymore." Her gaze didn't waver. "Then I choose to stay. Not because I have to, but because I want to." The words settled between them like a final piece falling into place. Eli said nothing for a long moment, then reached across the small space and took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of her hand gently. She didn't pull away. That night they slept close under a single blanket for warmth, not because the cold forced it, but because neither of them wanted the distance anymore. Outside, the creek continued to flow gently, and for the first time since Las Cruces, the thought of a future together felt less like an idea and more like something solid. Tomorrow would be the day to end this, one way or another. They broke camp before the sun had crested the eastern ridge. The air was cold enough to sting the lungs, the creek beside them flowing in a steady ripple. Eli packed the last of the supplies into the wagon, rechecking the straps on the water barrel and the rifle across the seat. He didn't have to tell Tahana to keep watch. She was already standing on the small mound above the camp, her eyes sweeping the path they had traveled. "They will try again," she said when he joined her. Eli nodded. "Then today we'll end it." The unspoken truth between them was clear: running forever was not a plan. If those men thought they could keep tracking them, they would never stop. Eli had decided last night that the next encounter would be the last. They drove the wagon north, following the low ground where mesquite and rock outcrops gave them cover. The morning passed without a sign of trouble, but by midday, Eli spotted dust in the far distance behind them, visible only in the dry air. It was growing steadily, the kind of dust that only riders made when they were pushing their horses hard. "They're closing in," he said. Instead of heading straight forward, Eli steered the team toward a narrow box canyon he had scouted out a few days before. It was a place with a single entrance and a canyon floor just wide enough for the wagon to turn around. He drove in, positioning the wagon at an angle so it blocked most of the opening. The rock walls on either side would force the riders to face him head-on. He tied the horses, loaded his rifle, and checked his pistol. Tahana stood beside him, holding spare ammunition. "If you fall," she began. "I won't," he said, meeting her eyes. "But if I do, you take the team and run hard for the ridge. Don't look back." She shook her head once, sharply. "I won't leave you." The sound of pounding hooves echoed into the mouth of the canyon. 3 riders appeared, the leader in front, the same man who had sneered outside the inn door. He stopped his horse just outside of rifle range, his sneer sharp. "You've cost me time and money, freight man," he said. "Hand over the girl and I'll let you go." Eli didn't reply. The rifle was braced against his shoulder, steady as bedrock. The leader's sneer sagged. "You'd shoot me over an Apache Girl?" "She's my wife," Eli said. "That's all you need to know." The man's face tightened and he urged his horse forward. Eli fired once, the bullet kicking up dirt a foot from the horse's hoof, making the animal rear. The other two riders tried to fan out, but the narrow space forced them to slow. Eli fired again, this time nicking the arm of the nearest man. The sound of the shot echoed against the rock walls. Tahana's calm voice came from behind him. "Aim higher next time." The leader saw in Eli's eyes the certainty that there would be no more warning shots. He cursed, jerked his reins, and turned his horse around. The other two followed, their retreat noisy and fast. The sound of their hooves disappeared into the distance until there was only the quiet of the canyon. Eli lowered his rifle, letting out a slow breath. Tahana came to his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "It's over," she said. "Yeah," Eli replied, though his eyes stayed on the mouth of the canyon for another moment before he was sure. They moved the wagon out of the entrance and drove north again, the afternoon light turning the rock walls gold. By evening, they reached a wide valley with scattered cottonwoods and a creek running through the grass. Eli stopped the team and looked out over the land. "This could be home," he said. Tahana stepped down from the wagon, walking toward the creek. She stood there for a moment, then turned back to him. "This is the first place that hasn't felt like I'm just passing through." That night, they made camp without the tension of the past few days. The fire burned brighter, the sound of the creek was close. After they ate, Eli reached into the small chest under his seat and took out a strip of rawhide, twisting it into a loop. He handed it to her. "It's not silver," he said. "But it'll do until I can make another." She took it, slipping it onto her finger. "It's enough." When they lay down, it wasn't for warmth or for safety. It was because neither of them wanted the distance between them anymore. Her head rested on his chest, his arm was around her, and for the first time since Las Cruces, there was no need to plan for the next day's escape. By morning, they decided to stay in the valley. Eli would build a small log cabin near the creek. Tahana would plant a garden. They would make the place their own, not because they had to but because they chose to. And when the wind carried the sound of distant riders a few weeks later, it no longer mattered. Those men had already lost.